547 BC. As Thales had feared, Persia, the most powerful empire of its day, seized control of Ionia. But 50 years later, chafing under the rule of Persian tyrants, the Ionians revolted, with the help of the newly democratic city-state, Athens. The revolt was brutally suppressed. In Thales' hometown, Miletus, most of the men were killed and the women and children enslaved. Many of the survivors fled to the city of Lampsacos, and Persia resolved to conquer Greece and punish the Athenians for their treachery. What came next was unexpected. Persia, the most powerful empire of its day, was defeated. The story is well known and much too long to tell here. Suffice it to say that the Athenians defeated the Persians at the famous Battle of Marathon, and later at Salamis. And with that, after years of fighting, the Greeks had secured their independence. Historians often call this one of the most important conflicts in the history of the world. Western art, culture, philosophy, and science are direct descendants of the Greeks. If the Persians had won, how very different this series would be. Up to this point, Greek philosophy was Ionian philosophy. If you remember, Thales, Anaximander, and Pythagoras all came from Ionia originally. But now, after defeating Persia, Athens ascended to become the commercial and cultural center of Greece. And the one to bring Ionian philosophy to Athens was a man named Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras was born in the city of Clazomene, in Ionia, on what's now the western coast of Turkey, sometime around 500 BC. Although he was born of wealthy parents, he reportedly gave up his inheritance to devote himself to natural philosophy. At the age of 20, shortly after the Persian Wars, he moved to Athens. He eventually made friends with the famous Pericles. Athens' democracy was young back then, and Pericles was perhaps its most well-respected statesman. So much so, in fact, that this period, when Athens was the educational and cultural center of Greece, is often called the Age of Pericles. Anaxagoras' friendship to Pericles had its advantages, no doubt, but it also had its drawbacks, as we'll soon see. But interestingly, despite Pericles' fame and stature, Plutarch tells us that it was Anaxagoras who enhanced Pericles' reputation, not the other way around. Now, Anaxagoras wrote a book which described his philosophy, called On Nature, which was apparently a popular title for a book those days. Only a few fragments remain today, but we do know a number of the things he taught. For us, though, the most important are what he thought about the sun and the moon. You see, Anaxagoras was one of the first to hold that the moon glows not because of its own light, but because it reflects the sun's light. We can't say for sure why he believed this, but I can try to piece together his train of thought. Last time, we saw that Anaximander had the revolutionary idea that the Earth is not held up by any supports. This allowed the sun and the moon to pass under the earth once per day. Anaximander thought that the sun and the moon were fires in a wheel with holes in it. But once you allow for things passing under the earth, it's not too much of a leap to imagine that maybe the sun and the moon are actually just big rocks hurtling around the earth. And this is precisely what we know Anaximander thought. In fact, he thought the sun was a red-hot rock, possibly because of a meteorite that had fallen, which he mistakenly thought was a piece of a star. In any event, some say he thought the sun was huge, roughly the size of the Peloponnese. Okay, so maybe today we'd say that's rather a bit small for the sun. Anyway, once you think of the sun and the moon not as gods, but as just regular objects, it seems reasonable that they would reflect light and cast shadows, just like any other object. And Anaxagoras likely noticed something important. Do you notice anything interesting here? You've all probably noticed that sometimes you can see the moon during the day. But you might not have noticed that the light side of the moon is always facing the sun. And here we see it again. And again. Here's the light side of the moon. And the sun is dutifully sitting right here. It starts to seem like maybe Anaxagoras is right. In fact, once you start to think like this, everything falls into place. This is why the moon starts as a new moon, then turns to a crescent, then to a half moon, then a full moon, and then back. Of course, because the moon is just a big round rock reflecting the sun's light. And once you start thinking like that, I imagine you can't help but wonder what happens when the moon passes behind the earth. I mean, wouldn't the earth block the sun's light and cast a shadow on the moon? Maybe that's what a lunar eclipse is. And that's exactly what Anaximander thought. He thought eclipses were when one heavenly body blocked the light from another body. And of course, he was right. Although he sometimes also attributed them to various other unseen bodies that block the light, apparently to explain why eclipses of the moon happen more often than eclipses of the sun. By the way, you might wonder, hey, if the moon passes behind the Earth once a month, then shouldn't we have both a lunar and a solar eclipse once every month? Good question. But the answer to that will have to wait for another day. Now, some of you are probably thinking, why does he keep saying that people thought the sun and moon and planets were gods? No one actually believed that literally, right? They just maybe used the gods as a metaphor or something, right? Well, no. Many people literally believed that they were gods. You see, Anaxagoras was charged with impiety, thrown in jail, and sentenced to death for teaching that the moon and sun were just rocks and not divine beings. Now, the enemies of Pericles were probably behind this. That's a drawback of having friends in high places, I suppose. But I think it tells you something about what the average Athenian believed at that time nonetheless. However, Pericles was able to help Anaxagoras get out of prison before he was executed, and he fled to Lampsacos, the same place a lot of the citizens of Miletus fled to after their city was destroyed by the Persians. After his death, the citizens of Lampsacos erected an altar to Mind and Truth in his honor, so at least someone appreciated him. Meanwhile, back in southern Italy, if you remember from last time, some of the Pythagoreans had been killed and others forced by their enemies to flee their city of Croton. One of the Pythagoreans who made it out alive was a man named Philolaus, depicted here rocking out on a flute with Pythagoras, because the Pythagoreans were the first to work out a detailed theory of music and harmony, but that story would take us far off topic. Philolaus fled Croton and ended up in Tarentum, nearby. It was here that he put forward a daring new hypothesis. He claimed that the Earth actually revolved once every 24 hours around something he called the central fire. No, the central fire is not the sun, but rather a new object. We don't see it though, because as the Earth orbits the central fire, it always has its back to it, and we live on the other side, which is always facing away from the central fire. All in all, he thought a total of 10 bodies revolved around this central fire: the Earth, Moon, Sun, the 5 known planets, and the stars. Oh, and one more. The anti-Earth. You see, as a Pythagorean, he believed that the number 10 held a mystical significance, so he needed an extra celestial body. We never see the anti-Earth because we live on one side of the actual Earth, and the Earth and the anti-Earth revolve around the central fire in such a way that the Earth always has its back to the anti-Earth. How convenient. By assuming that the Earth goes around the central fire every 24 hours, the Moon once in 29.5 days, and the Sun once a year, he could at least roughly explain their positions in the sky. But we don't have his original book, and without knowing more details, it's hard to say if he managed to explain the solstices and equinoxes. And his model doesn't really explain the funny motions of the planets at all. Honestly, I probably wouldn't have mentioned his theory at all, except for one thing. He's the first person I know of to imagine that the Earth actually moves. He had just about everything else wrong, but he was at least willing to put forward an idea that sounded crazy to his contemporaries. In fact, many centuries later, when Copernicus came up with his theory that the sun is at the center and the Earth and planets all revolve around it, he would explicitly mention Philolaus as an influence on his thinking. One of the things that stands out against previous ages is that the philosophers that we've been discussing left the gods out of the story. It's not that they didn't believe in the gods, they just didn't drag them into their explanations of how the world worked. But I've been cherry-picking our philosophers' ideas a bit here. The truth is that their new ideas were all over the map. Let me give you a sampling. Thales believed that water was the primary substance. Anaximenes believed it was air. No. It's fire, according to Heraclitus. Okay, let's just say that there are 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. If you think that sounds a little silly, so did Anaximander. He thought the world was made out of just one primary substance, but that substance was a sort of mystery, indeterminate substance he called apeiron. So what about the forces that move matter around? Empedocles had an idea. It seems that there are 2 kinds of force, a pulling and a pushing. Let's call them love and strife. Okay, good. So how did the world form? Xenophanes thought the world was originally a sort of muddy mixture of earth and water, and over time the 2 separated. The Pythagoreans believed in what we call dualism, so that the celestial bodies, as we've learned, are perfect, moving eternally in circles, while the terrestrial world experiences endless changes, decay, and death. Parmenides argued, on the other hand, that change and motion are unreal. The universe is eternal, changeless, motionless. And then Anaxagoras taught that there is neither coming into being nor ceasing to be, but there are only commixtures and decompositions, and that the universe was originally a chaos of innumerable seeds to which the mind gave order and form. What's that, you say? You didn't quite catch that? Yeah, me neither. And then there were Leucippus and Democritus, who believed that the world must be made of tiny indivisible particles that Democritus called atoms. These days, Democritus gets all the credit for being the first to imagine that the world is made of atoms. But in fact, it was his teacher Leucippus who came up with this idea. Unfortunately, Leucippus's writings have all been lost, and in any event, he never seems to have come up with a name for these little particles. So the world remembers his student, Democritus, who gave them the name atoms, and further elaborated on his ideas. Democritus argued that there are an infinite number of these atoms, and they have different sizes and shapes. Over 2,000 years later, when chemists began to realize that matter really was made out of tiny particles, they reached back to the golden age of Greece and grabbed the name atom and made Democritus famous again. But make no mistake, Democritus's atomic theory was very different from the modern one. So how does vision work? Well, some philosophers believed that our eyes emit feeling rays. At the other end, the Pythagoreans thought no. Objects must emit particles that our eyes see. Empedocles split the difference and thought that some rays emanate from objects, while our eyes emit other rays, and we see because these two rays meet somewhere in the middle. Now, I've been poking fun at our Greek philosophers here a bit. Their theories were all over the map, and from our standpoint 2,500 years later, their science, if you could call it that, is extremely sloppy. But they were just beginning. They hadn't invented the scientific method yet. They fell prey to a very human way of thinking. They made the same mistakes that are made by many people today who haven't had training in the scientific way of thinking. They wanted to jump to the big, sexy, abstract questions, without rolling up their sleeves and putting in the hard work of studying the small, simpler questions first. They wanted to start with the grand, abstract, general principles, and simply reason their way down to the particulars. They thought you could just sort of sit back in your armchair and reason your way through the world, figure it out without actually checking your conclusions against observation. They showed the intellectual curiosity and courage to challenge the old ideas and come up with new ones. They were very good at generating new ideas, but they hadn't figured out how to throw out the bad ideas. There are infinite permutations of things you might believe when your beliefs aren't tethered to actual empirical observations. And the Greeks seem to have stumbled across a lot of them. So the 5th century might have been known as the golden age of Greek culture, but it wasn't the golden age of Greek science. Not yet. But Athens' golden age was violently interrupted by the Peloponnesian War. South of Athens, on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, was a powerful Athenian rival, the militaristic city-state of Sparta. In the past, it had been the unquestioned military leader of the Greeks. But after the surprise triumph of Athens over Persia at the Battle of Marathon, Sparta's military leadership was no longer beyond question. the Spartans became suspicious of the Athenians' intentions, who, in turn, expected Sparta would preemptively attack. Eventually, the expected war came. The horror of the Peloponnesian War far exceeded the expectations of either side at the outset. For more than 25 long years, the democracy of Athens was at war with the oligarchy of Sparta. Men slaughtered each other with an enthusiasm never before seen in Greece. The Athenians hunkered down behind their city walls as they watched the Spartans destroy their farms and livelihoods. And to top it all off, Athens was struck by a massive and vicious plague. In the midst of this political and social turmoil, there lived a philosopher by the name of Socrates. And although no one would mistake him for a physicist, he changed the course of Western philosophy, beginning a process that led eventually to Aristotle, who is often called the father of science. So I'd be doing you an injustice if I didn't at least mention him. In those days, there came to be what you might call traveling teachers, who would go around teaching for money. The Greeks called them sophists, and they eventually got a reputation for being moneymakers and hypocrites. They'd make simple things sound complicated, and complicated things sound simple. Either way, they always made a buck, charging people to listen to their intelligent-sounding nonsense. I'm sure you know the type. Socrates was also a bit of a traveling teacher, but he set himself apart. He never accepted money for his teaching, choosing to live simply. He preferred clarity of thought and precise definitions, rather than the form of philosophy that you might call word juggling, where you're never really sure exactly what the philosopher is talking about, and frankly, they probably aren't sure either. Oh, and he avoided all that nature of the universe talk. And after hearing the mess of ideas floating out there at the time, with no way of sorting the good from the bad, I'm sure you can at least appreciate the point of view. So the story goes, his friend Chaerephon asked the oracle of Delphi if there was anyone wiser than Socrates, and the priestess replied that there was not. Socrates was puzzled. The oracle doesn't lie, but he had no wisdom at all. So Socrates set out to prove the oracle wrong. He sought out everyone in the city that had a reputation for wisdom, so he could bring one of them to the oracle and say, "See, here's someone who's wiser than me." But as he talked with these people, he soon discovered that though they had a reputation of wisdom and thought themselves wise, they didn't really seem to know anything. Socrates figured he didn't know anything either, but he had an edge on them because at least he knew nothing. And so maybe the oracle was right after all. And this is how Socrates got his start interrogating the people of Athens. Socrates viewed himself as a gadfly of the state. His job was to go around talking with all the people of power and reputation, stirring them to life with his inquiries and reproaches. He used logic and clear thinking. He required intellectual honesty and declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. He questioned them on all aspects of ethics and morality. He questioned how they knew what they thought they knew. And he was relentless. You can imagine that these interrogations didn't earn him many friends among the powerful. But on the other hand, he was apparently quite popular with many of the young men around town, and he acquired quite a student following. But the Peloponnesian War spared no one. In his 30s, as Athens tumbled into war, Socrates was sent to battle as a hoplite. While the Athenians faced heavy losses, he distinguished himself by saving the life of his friend and future statesman and general, Alcibiades. Socrates eventually returned to civic life, but the war with Sparta dragged on, and as it did, with Athens stumbling towards defeat, the Athenians became impassioned, and their democracy grew increasingly frenzied and erratic. The democracy was overthrown in an oligarchic coup, which was itself overthrown in turn. Soon thereafter, the Spartans laid siege to Athens and overtook the city, helping put in place a government known as the 30 Tyrants, who quickly tried to consolidate their power, executing dissidents. Unrest, then chaos, spread through the city as democrats and oligarchs fought for control of Athens. The Democrats eventually won, but Athens was never quite the same. By now it was 399 BC. In these tumultuous times of war, when emotions were running high, the Athenians were in no mood for a gadfly of the state, and Socrates found himself charged with impiety, a capital offense. The Athenians were devout to the point of superstition, and though Socrates had a mystical side, his rationality was shocking to many, and his social and moral criticism surely didn't earn him any friends, especially in such tumultuous times. Earlier in the war, after Athens experienced a terrible military loss at sea, Socrates had served on a jury to decide the fate of the generals who had been in charge and who had had to make difficult decisions in the fog of battle. The impassioned jury, overcome with emotions, had sentenced the generals to death for failing to save the wounded and collect the dead in a trial that violated Athenian law. Socrates alone had stood up in their defense at the injustice of the trial. But he had been unsuccessful, and the generals were sentenced to death. But this time, it was Socrates' turn to be tried by such a jury. He was found guilty of rejecting the gods acknowledged by the state and of corrupting the youth, and he was sentenced to death by drinking poison hemlock. In Socrates' prison cell, his friends gathered and watched as their friend and teacher was slowly paralyzed by the poison. The moment was captured in a moving passage in the famous work entitled Phaedo, by Socrates' most famous student, the young philosopher, Plato.